Thank you. So indeed, some very tough acts to follow, and I'm very grateful that my talk is indeed something completely different. So my challenge is how to scale vital signs monitoring and to solve some of the big challenges that we face demographically over the coming decades. My company's vision is to turn every mobile device on the planet into a personal health monitoring platform. So something about the challenge. We currently don't really have a healthcare system, either in the developed world and certainly not yet in the developing world. What we really have is a sick care system where we mend broken people. And that system is beginning to break down and will further break down with the demographic time bomb that's approaching. What we need to understand, as well as some of these wonderful breakthroughs in genetics, is to find a more efficient and empowering way for people to personally manage their own healthcare, to move away from fixative to preventative, trying to understand how do we monitor people in a way that engages vast populations and is cost effective. What we have at the moment for personal health monitoring, there's really sort of two approaches. There is the medical world of systems like telecare, telehealth, remote patient monitoring. But these all require clunky hardware. So we're using devices like blood pressure cuffs, which really have evolved from the SFIG. So they're kind of almost Victorian but updated hardware. They're uncomfortable, they're difficult to use. Something like 97% of patients actually don't use a cuff properly that have a cuff. And in fact, just talking about blood pressure as the first point, cardiovascular disease, as we know, is one of the major diseases in terms of prevalence. There are something like over 1 billion hypertensives in the world. And yet we understand, or we estimate, that at least 50% of those are undiagnosed. So there are walking time bombs of people with potential strokes and MIs, all of the personal costs and social and healthcare costs awaiting the system as they age. But then out of those who do have diagnosed hypertensives, something like 50%, certainly in the UK, are not using any form of self-monitoring. They don't have a cuff, and maybe they've tried using cuffs and they're too uncomfortable and they've stopped using them. So they're kind of 50% unmanaged of those who are diagnosed. And that's before we move on to COPD and other long-term conditions, diabetes. So there's a whole problem with the ability to health monitor using conventional equipment. If you have a telehealth service, people have to ship you equipment. It has to be distributed logistically. It needs to then be collected up, cleaned, reserviced, recalibrated, sent out to new cohorts of patients. So what happens is you end up stratifying by need, and only the most unwell get to use telehealth services currently because it's expensive and time consuming. And patients aren't great at compliance as well. You tend to find cohorts that you have to keep on nagging, calling them. And so literally you have call centers then phoning people saying, you haven't taken your blood pressure this morning, take your blood pressure. So it's a very kind of friction-based system. So you may say, well, wearables, they're going to solve this. Wearables are fantastic. And I agree, wearables are great, but there's a high cost to them. We're talking of $50 to $500 per unit. And this doesn't address, for example, countries like India, where you have over 1 billion smartphones, and yet you have limited access to healthcare. So all of these lead to this conclusion that current personal health monitoring doesn't scale. We have developed a technology called Lifelight, which, as introduced, can measure somebody's vital signs, in particular blood pressure, as well as pulse, respiration, oxygen saturations, AFib detection, simply by the patient looking into the camera on their smartphone for 40 seconds. This is quite transformative, to put it bluntly, because there is no cuff, there is no hardware. We are using the ubiquity of mobile devices, something that everyone has in their pocket. That's the key really to the scalability. This essentially has infinite scale up to the point of smartphone ownership. It's low friction, it's simple to use. People already are spending maybe arguably too long looking at their cameras on their phones, looking at their screens. And so we're simply asking them to spend 40 seconds to take these physiological vital signs. Importantly, we've worked hard to make this clinically meaningful. There are lots of well-being products being developed. There's a whole boom in the well-being market. And the problem is credibility and clinical utility. Unless something is validated and evidence-built and evidence-based, then the data from it has very poor provenance. It may be useful, informative, like how many steps somebody's walked, but it can't really be used in clinical decision-making, either for the patient themselves to self-manage or for their clinicians to titrate medication or to form diagnoses. So how do we do this? We use a science called remote PPG as the basis for this. So if you're familiar with pulse oximetry using a finger clip, the science of remote PPG uses a similar concept, but using reflected light from the surface of the skin. Every camera that you have on your smartphone will be taking a constant stream of images when recording video. And we look at those red, green, and blue channels, 30 frames a second, and use those to process using a signal processing and cleansing operation. We extract a blood volume pulse. So by combining the red, green, and blue channels using a technique called independent component analysis, followed by further filtering and cleansing, we create a blood volume pulse, which at a basic level, we can count the pulses. There's an underlying respiratory signal for respiration. There's information in terms of the relative color strengths in the channels and amplitudes for oxygen saturations. But how do we do blood pressure? That requires a huge amount of data. Basically, our 7-year development of Lifelight has been focused on data. You could actually say that Lifelight is really born out of clinical studies. Our very first study was very much a learning curve where we introduced informal patients and participants. We recorded healthy people and we built a data set of about 1,000 people. When I say built a data set, what we needed to do was record 60 seconds of video of a person's face while taking concurrent ground truth, vital signs information. And as anyone involved in data science knows, your first data set tells you all the things that you should have collected. What we discovered was we needed to understand more about the physiology of the individual. We needed to understand their demographics. We wanted as much kind of contextual data as possible. We also learned about the importance of high quality and getting good lighting, building the very best signal quality we could. And I'll never forget the first kind of engagement with clinicians with our wonderful prototype that we were so proud of. The first question was, well, does this work with sick people? And of course, what we created was a normalized, normal distribution data set, which told everyone they were pretty healthy. And provided you're pretty healthy, it got it right most of the time. So we fell foul to the first kind of crime of statistics. And so we went on, thanks to a NHS grant, and worked with Portsmouth Hospital to collect 8,500 patient recordings. Now, this was an open study, and we very quickly learned we were building another normal distribution, because even in a hospital context, most people are somewhere in the middle. And so we had to learn over time to run further studies in order to overtrain and oversample at the extremes in order to be clinically useful. So an interesting point there is when you're developing an AI model, the data is so fundamental, but it's not the data that you naturally collect. You have to consciously make decisions about where you want the information to reside. So for blood pressure, for example, normotensive blood pressure is not really that helpful. what we needed to understand was our sensitivity within hypertension. So are we good at detecting hypertensives? And to do that, we needed to find lots of hypertensives. And again, the problem in hospitals is most people who are in hospital are probably on medication for hypertension. So they will present as normotensive. So then we had to look for the undiagnosed. And the same with hypotension. So looking at people with very low blood pressure. And physiologically, it's not sufficient just to go and recruit healthy young students that have very low blood pressure. We needed to find people who were deteriorating, who actually had a pathological hypertension. So it's very important to understand those kind of differences. So all of this data, what do we do with it? Well, the answer is we look at various features of the blood volume pulse that we've video recorded, and we match that against the ground truth. So the first things you begin to notice are differences in the pulse morphology. And by that, I mean the waveform that you see simply by looking at the face. We're actually picking up a blood volume pulse. So we see a systolic blood volume pulse with a diacritic notch. We see all of the kind of morphological information that can be used to derive a measure of blood pressure. So we look for features that positively correlate. There are timing differences. And I give the analogy of a drum beat, for example, for arterial stiffness. So a drum that's very tight gives a very different waveform to a loose drum. And in the same way, we can see in the pulse morphology indications of arterial stiffness. Well, that's great for hypertension, but when people are hypotensive, their arteries don't simply get softer. And so we have to look for other features and then classify into different ranges. But of course, all of this is very data thirsty, and hence the number of studies that we've had to run, in particular, recruiting unwell people. We also separate this out into validation studies. So we can't simply use contaminated data that we've been using for training when we want to measure our accuracy. So we run validation studies as independently as possible. We're going to a US lab currently to run our current validation to measure our blood pressure. So we hand over a frozen version of the algorithm, and we ask the lab to take an accurate assessment of the performance of the device. We're about to embark on a pediatric study next year. So we're going to be recruiting infants in order to understand their differences in physiology so that we can extend the range of the device to work across all age groups. So it's a constant iterative journey in data collection, learning, measuring, validation, rebuilding, and retraining. In terms of where this can be used, this is where AI becomes really practical and very exciting. So we are currently working with a health hub that's a vaccination center of the NHS, who are, as patients come through for vaccinations, they're identifying and encouraging members of the public to use Lifelight in a kiosk mode. So it's to simply walk up, take a blood pressure reading by looking into the camera. And we've already successfully signposted patients or members of the public who were unaware that they had potentially high risk CVD, consequently from their high blood pressure. So the advantage is there's just no calibration needed. It's instant. Because of our model training, when Lifelight looks at a new face, it's able to estimate blood pressure based on all of the training of the faces that it's seen from our data sets. But the real opportunities lie in the home, where we can do remote patient monitoring using patients' own devices at home. And there's really two broad categories. There, if you like, is continuous monitoring or remote patient monitoring, where you have a long-term condition. And then there's mobile and virtual health, where you might have a video consultation with a GP or a clinician remotely. And being able to add physiological vital signs to that conversation significantly improves the function and purpose of that call. So Lifelight really is at the heart of some fairly fundamental changes in terms of digital health. There's the mobile health segment, the remote patient monitoring, and virtual health. So we feel like we're somewhere in the kind of eye of the storm in terms of these amazing changes in digital healthcare. So how do we get to scale? It comes back to my beginning point. We have learned to be humble with this, to say we have one job to do, which is to find the most accurate and usable measurements of vital signs using the patient's own device. What we don't want to reinvent is the huge growth and investment in platforms for digital health. So what we've been doing is partnering globally with existing telehealth and virtual health providers to allow for scale. And they literally describe Lifelight as the silver bullet. So we've allowed them to scale their services much more radically than simply by using hardware. So we're poised really to disrupt the healthcare system. What we're trying to do as a company is to ensure that we move as rapidly but safely as possible through regulatory approvals, being evidence-based. There will be, and there are, new competitors coming into this space, which we welcome because it's such a high growth industry and it's quite validating and informing to have competition. It's a good thing. So in summary, I think there are kind of 3 points I wanted to make around how do we scale personal health monitoring. I think the first thing is to look for ubiquity. So everybody has access to, if they don't have a smart device of some form. And this is a trend that's going to be continuing. And then secondly, to leverage partners who already are present on those devices for patients with with health needs. And then thirdly, really to strategically target. We're beginning to do this proactively, looking at the kind of key fundamental disease verticals, geographies where they have the highest prevalence, and understanding the right partners, targeting proactively the partners and platforms to work with to ensure that Lifelight has the greatest impact. So my prediction for the future is that healthcare will need to evolve into self-care. This really is backed up by this perfect storm, as we call it, between the demographic time bomb. We have the baby boomer generation becoming into that stage of life where the health needs are going to be greater. So we have a large peak in population that are going to require more healthcare demands on the service, which already has limited resources. And that's at the same time as the health needs of developing markets expanding. Therefore, future levels of care are going to depend on technologies such as Lifelight. Thank you.